They came at dawn when the fog kissed the graves, when the mist crawled low over the grass like pale hands reaching for warmth, when the trees stood silent, watching without blinking, when the cold sank into their boots and made their teeth press together as they moved in shadows. They were 5 of them, wrapped in old coats that smelled of smoke and wet earth. They whispered to each other about how easy it would be to take from the dead, because the dead could not scream, the dead could not fight back, the dead could not follow them into the dark. The leader was a tall man with a scar under his eye. He had been the one to say there was gold buried with the bodies. Here he had been the one to say the villagers were fools who left rings on the fingers of their dead, who left coins on the eyes of their loved ones, who left silver under the tongue to pay for the journey to the other side. He said it was a waste of silver when the dead could not spend it, and he laughed when he said it, and the others laughed too, but their laughter was quiet because the fog made the world smaller and the air was heavy with something they did not want to name. They carried small shovels and a lantern that flickered in the mist, a small yellow flame that made the fog glow like old milk. They stepped over graves, careful not to trip over crooked stones, careful not to slip on the wet grass. They moved like dogs in the dark, sniffing for the place where the earth was still soft, where the ground had not settled yet, where they could find the newest dead. The leader raised a hand to stop them and pointed to a small grave near the edge of the forest, a small mound of fresh dirt covered in pine branches and old flowers already wilting. In the cold, the smell of pine was strong, sharp enough to taste. On their tongues they knelt and brushed away the branches, their fingers cold and stiff. The earth was damp and dark under the pine needles. The leader drove the shovel into the dirt with a sound that was too loud in the fog, a thick wet sound that made the birds in the trees flutter in their sleep. They dug in silence, breathing hard, steam rising from their mouths, mixing with the mist. They dug until the shovel hit with a dull, hollow thump that made one of them flinch. They looked at each other, eyes wide and shining. In the lantern light, the leader grinned and wiped sweat from his brow, streaking dirt across his skin. They scraped the dirt away with their hands, brushing it off the coffin until the old wood was clear, dark, and cracked with age, but not yet rotting. The leader placed a hand on the coffin lid and looked at the others. His grin was sharp in the fog. He said the gold would be inside. He said the rings would still be on the fingers. He said the dead could not stop them. He pressed his fingers under the lid and lifted it slowly. The wood creaked softly, the sound of old wood breathing after too long in the dark. They leaned over to look inside, their breath hanging in the air over the coffin, mixing with the smell of pine and damp earth, and something else, something like old smoke and cold iron. They saw the shape inside, wrapped in dark cloth hair, like tangled seaweed, gray and long and wild. Around a pale face, lips pale and thin, as if pressed forever into silence, the eyes closed, sunken but not hollow, yet the hands folded over the chest, small rings of gold and copper on thin fingers, a small silver coin on each eye, a silver coin on the tongue pressed between the lips, as the village did for the dead to pay for the crossing to keep them safe in the dark. They looked at each other, and the leader smiled again. He reached in and took one of the rings, the gold warm from the earth, as if the dead held heat, even now, and in that moment the fog moved and the world felt smaller, and the trees seemed closer, and the air grew colder, and they did not see the lips twitch. They did not see the lips twitch as they took the rings from the thin fingers, as they took the coins from the eyes that seemed to sink deeper into the skull. As the coins lifted away, they did not hear the soft sound of breath like wind over dry leaves. They only saw gold and silver shining in their dirty hands, and they smiled with teeth that looked white in the mist. They whispered to each other about how many more graves they could find before dawn, about how much more they could take before the crows began to call, about how the village would never know who came to steal from their dead. They spoke as if the forest could not hear them, as if the ground under their knees was not listening. They spoke of ale and bread and the warmth of fire they would buy with the gold. They spoke of the coins as payment for the cold nights they spent hiding in the woods. They spoke of the rings as if they belonged to them, as if the hands they took them from were nothing but old sticks wrapped in skin. They did not see the fog grow thicker around them, rolling like a living thing, swallowing the trees and the graves and the lantern light. They did not see the shadows moving between the birch trees, bending the branches as they passed. They did not feel the cold change, the kind of cold that sinks into the bones and makes the heart beat slower, the kind of cold that carries the scent of ash and iron and old pine. They only saw the next ring on the next finger. They only saw the gold and nothing else, until the smallest of them, the one with the soft voice and shaking hands, looked into the face of the dead woman and saw the eyes open, slow and silent like frost. spreading over glass. The green glow was soft at first like moss, under moonlight, and then it grew sharp, bright enough to show the lines on her pale skin, the cracks on her dry lips, the dirt in her hair. The boy tried to speak, but the words turned to smoke in his mouth. He tried to move, but the cold was too heavy around his legs. The others did not see at first. They were laughing at a joke the leader made, about how the dead woman should thank them for taking the rings, so she would not be robbed by worms. They were laughing until the boy fell back into the dirt, his eyes wide and mouth open, but no sound came out. They turned to him, and saw the eyes in the coffin watching them, and for the first time that night, none of them spoke. The leader dropped the ring he was holding, and it fell into the dirt with a sound that was small but loud. In the cold morning fog, the woman in the coffin lifted one hand, slow and stiff like a branch in winter, the fingers curled like roots reaching for the light. She placed her hand on the edge of the coffin, and her nails scratched the wood as she pulled herself up. The fog wrapped around her hair, lifting it like dark water. The forest was silent as she sat up, her eyes never leaving the men who came to take from her, the men who came to rob her grave while she was still breathing, while she was still waiting, while she was still alive. She sat up with her hair falling around her like a storm of shadows, the mist curling around her shoulders as if it knew her, as if it belonged to her. The men could not move as they watched her eyes glow brighter in the gray dawn. The forest around them held its breath, the crows in the trees silent, the cold digging into their bones. As she turned her head, slow to look at each of them, her face was pale and sharp like carved bone, her lips cracked, but curling into something that might have been a smile if it did not feel like a promise of something waiting in the dark. She placed her bare feet on the cold earth, and the ground seemed to sigh under her weight. The fog thickened around her legs, twisting like smoke around her ankles. She stood taller than they thought she would, her hair brushing her waist, tangled with small bones and bits of dark feathers. Her hands were thin but strong as she lifted them to brush dirt from her shoulders, her fingers leaving streaks of dark earth on her skin. The men still could not move as she stepped forward, each footstep silent but heavy, as if the ground itself was helping her walk. She looked down at the rings they had dropped in the dirt, small circles of gold and copper and silver, reflecting the pale light. Her eyes flicked to the men, and the cold around them grew sharper. The leader tried to speak, tried to tell her they meant no harm, tried to say they would put everything back, but his mouth would not open, his tongue heavy as stone in his mouth. She bent slowly, picking up one of the rings with her thin fingers, turning it in the air, the green light in her eyes reflecting on the metal. She looked at the leader and then at the others, and then at the ring, and she laughed. A low, dry sound like wind moving through dead leaves. The forest seemed to echo the sound, the branches creaking in the cold. She whispered words that were soft but sharp, words that made the fog pulse, and the cold deepened, words that tasted like iron. In the air, the ground around the men began to shift, small cracks opening under their feet, the mud sucking at their boots, the roots of the trees moving like dark veins in the earth. The smallest of them fell to his knees, the cold so deep he could not feel his hands. He tried to crawl, but the mud pulled him down, his fingers sinking into the cold earth. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving them, as she whispered again, her voice like a promise and a curse. At once the leader tried to pull the boy up, but the mud would not let him go, the roots curling around the boy's legs, holding him still. She raised her hand, and the forest seemed to lean closer, the branches bending as if listening. The mist lifted around her like a cloak, the cold, a living thing wrapping around the men, holding them where they stood. She told them, in a voice that was older than the trees, older than the bones under the earth, that they had come to take from Baba Yaga while she still breathed, while she still waited, while she was still alive, and now the forest would take its payment. The forest would take its payment, she said, as the wind moved through the trees and the fog pulsed with her breath. The men could not look away from her eyes that burned with a soft green fire that flickered like candlelight in the mist. The leader felt the cold climb up his legs into his chest, and he could not draw a full breath, as if the air was thicker, heavier, pressing down on his lungs. The boy in the mud tried to scream, but the sound stuck in his throat like a stone. His fingers clawed at the earth, but the roots held him, pulling him deeper, pulling him closer to the cold heart of the forest. The others tried to run, but their feet would not move, the mud clinging to them like dark hands, the mist curling around their faces, blinding them, making the world small and gray and endless. Baba Yaga stepped closer, the ground not daring to make a sound under her feet, her hair lifting in the cold wind, small bones clicking softly in her tangled hair. She raised her hand, and the fog pulled back for a moment, showing the graves around them, showing the crooked stones and the open earth and the trees leaning close like silent watchers. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the clearing. It was the sound of winter wind, the sound of snow falling on dead leaves, the sound of a promise that would never break. She told them they came for gold and silver and rings from the dead. But they came to the wrong grave. They came to take from her while she was alive. They came to rob Baba Yaga while she waited, while she watched, while she breathed, and the forest did not forget. The forest did not forgive the leader. Tried to speak, tried to beg, but his voice cracked in the cold, the words falling from his mouth like broken glass. He said they would leave, he said they would put the rings back, he said they would never come again. But the forest was already listening to Baba Yaga. The forest was already moving, the roots pulling tighter, the mud sucking deeper, the cold pressing closer. The smallest of them felt the mud reach his chest, the cold sinking into his heart as he looked up at the pale face of Baba Yaga. Her eyes soft and endless and filled with something he could not name. He tried to remember the warmth of the fire, the taste of bread, the sound of laughter, but all he could feel was the cold. All he could see was the green light in her eyes. The others fell to their knees as the cold took them, the mud pulling at their arms, the roots wrapping around their legs, the mist wrapping around their heads. Baba Yaga stepped closer until they could see the lines on her face, the dirt on her skin, the small bones in her hair, her eyes burning brighter as she raised both hands, the forest holding its breath as she whispered again the words tasting of ash and winter, the words that made the ground shift, the words that made the mist shiver, the words that made the forest listen. The payment would be taken, she said, because the forest does not forget, the forest does not forgive, and Baba Yaga is never robbed while she still breathes. The payment would be taken, she said as her eyes glowed brighter, turning the mist green around her face. The forest leaned in, as if the trees wanted to hear every word. The men could not move, could not breathe right as the cold pressed closer. The mud was around their waists, now thick and heavy, pulling them down like the hands of the dead. The boy was crying without sound, tears mixing with the cold mist on his face, his fingers digging into the mud but finding no grip as the roots curled tighter around his legs. The leader tried to hold the boy up, but the cold was in his bones now, making his arms heavy as stone, making his breath slow as frost crawled across his skin. The others tried to speak, but their voices were lost in the fog, their words falling around them like ashes. Baba Yaga moved closer, her feet bare on the cold mud, her hair lifting in the breeze that came from nowhere, her eyes watching them with the quiet of old stones. She bent down and took the ring the leader had dropped, lifting it to her eyes, the gold reflecting the pale green light. She turned it in her fingers, the silence so deep it roared in their ears. She said they came to take gold from the dead, but the dead they tried to rob was not dead. She said they came to steal from her while she still breathed, while she still waited, while she still watched, and now they would give back what they took, not in gold, not in silver, but in breath and warmth and memory, because the forest needs to eat, the forest needs to remember, and the forest remembers everything. She let the ring fall back into the mud and it sank. Without a sound, the boy felt the mud rise to his chest, cold and thick like the bottom of a river, the roots tightening around his ribs, the cold pressing into his heart. He tried to call for his mother, for the warmth of her hand, for the sound of her singing, but the only sound was the wind through the trees and the soft voice of Baba Yaga as she spoke to the forest. The leader felt the cold slip into his mouth like water. He could not close his lips, could not swallow, as the cold filled him, the mist curling into his lungs. Baba Yaga lifted her hand and the fog moved with her, swirling around her fingers like smoke. The trees creaked in the cold, the branches bending as if bowing to her, as if afraid to break under her gaze. She looked at the men with eyes that were endless and cold as she told them this was the price of stealing from the forest. This was the price of waking the dead. This was the price of greed in the cold dawn, when the mist is alive and the trees remember your name. The mud pulled them deeper, the cold heavier, the mist closing around their heads. The last thing they saw was Baba Yaga, standing in the mist, her hair lifting in the breeze, her eyes bright with green fire as the forest took its payment and the dawn turned gray and silent. They tried to run, but the path twisted beneath their feet like a living snake, the pine needles sticking to their ankles, the moss shifting under their shoes, sucking them down into the cold mud. With every step, the trees leaning in, as if they were bending low to listen to their breathless prayers. The air smelled of burnt sugar and rot and iron, the taste of fear and something older rising from the earth like a sigh. The youngest one stumbled, fell on her knees, and the mud grabbed her hands, pulling them down, as if the ground was hungry for her touch. Her scream was swallowed by the thick fog that poured between the trees, wrapping around their legs. like wet cloth. The others tried to pull her up, but the ground was pulling harder, roots curling around her wrists like ropes, twisting and tightening while she cried for them not to leave her behind. The woman in the coffin was standing now, her hair floating around, her head like smoke, her eyes watching them with a hunger that was patient, her mouth curling into a smile that had no warmth. The sound of her laughter was soft, almost kind, as she took a step forward, and the ground trembled. The fog thickened, swallowing the trees and the sky, until all they could see was the white breath of each other and the black shape of her moving closer. The birds had gone silent. The world was holding its breath as she lifted her hand, and the crows came back, falling from the sky like drops of ink, wings flapping as they circled above. The crows were dropping bones, feathers, twigs that hit the mud and vanished like they had never been there. The fog was cold on their skin, and they felt the air pressing against their chests, squeezing out their screams. The youngest one was crying, shaking, mud dripping from her fingers as she tried to wipe it from her eyes, but the mud only spread across her face. The others were pulling her, dragging her by the arms. As the ground tried to hold her back, the trees moved, the branches scraping their faces, leaving thin lines of blood that stung in the cold. The sound of her laughter was everywhere around them, inside them, vibrating in their bones like the hum of an old engine. The woman stepped closer and closer, her feet leaving no mark on the mud, her eyes reflecting their fear back at them, as if she was tasting it. Her hair moved like it was alive, reaching for them with thin black strands that brushed against their shoulders, their necks, their faces. They tried to run faster, but the path twisted back on itself, bringing them in a circle no matter which way they turned, the fog hiding the way out, the trees closing in with a slow, patient hunger. They fell again, the mud swallowing their legs up to their knees, the roots wrapping around their ankles, pulling them down into the cold black water that was seeping from the ground, bubbles rising as they sank deeper and deeper. The woman was standing over them now, her smile soft like a mother seeing her children return, her hands reaching down to touch their heads one by one. Her voice was a whisper that was older than the trees, older than the stones, telling them to hush, telling them it was time to sleep. They screamed for help, but the fog swallowed their voices, turning them into small, broken echoes that fell into the mud around their feet. The crows flew lower, their wings brushing the tops of the twisted pines, their black feathers floating down and sticking to the wet earth like silent watchers. The air was cold against their skin, sharp like winter breath, and each of them felt the shaking inside their bones as the roots pulled tighter around their legs, pulling them deeper into the black water that was rising from the ground. The youngest one was still crying, her tears mixing with the mud on her face, turning it into streaks of dark across her cheeks, her hands clawing at the air as if she could catch something to hold on to, but there was nothing there, nothing but the cold. Nothing but the sound of her own breathing and the laughter that was coming from the woman standing above them, her hair floating in the air as if it was underwater, the strands reaching down like dark fingers brushing against their shoulders, against the tops of their heads. The laughter was soft and slow like the sound of an old clock ticking in a quiet room. Her eyes were bright and black, reflecting the small broken shapes of the people below her as they tried to pull free, as they tried to pray, as they tried to promise anything to make her stop. The crows circled closer, dropping small bones that landed softly on the mud near their feet, each bone sinking slowly into the black water, leaving only ripples that moved in slow circles. The fog thickened, pressing against their skin, pressing into their mouths and eyes, until it felt like they were breathing in water, like they were sinking, even though they were still clutching at the air. The trees creaked above them, leaning closer, the branches scraping against each other with dry whispers, as if the forest was speaking in a language they could not understand. The woman moved closer, each step silent, her feet gliding over the mud without leaving any trace. Her smile was small and patient as she watched them struggle, the sound of her laughter rising and falling like a lullaby that made the air vibrate in their chests. One of them tried to scream again, but the fog swallowed the sound, turning it into a thin breath that vanished. The crows landed on the branches above them, their black eyes blinking slowly as they watched the woman lift her hand and point one finger towards the youngest one. The roots shifted around her legs, pulling her down faster, the black water rising to her waist, to her chest, the mud pulling at her hair, at her clothes. The others grabbed her arms, pulling back with shaking hands, but the roots were stronger, pulling harder, until the black water was at her neck, until it was at her mouth. The woman was smiling as the youngest one looked up at her, eyes wide and shining with tears and fear. The last sound she made was a small soft gasp as the black water closed over her head, leaving only bubbles that rose and popped in the cold air as the woman lowered her hand and the crows began to sing. They promised her they meant no harm, their voices shaking as they tried to pull the youngest one from the black water that was swallowing her body inch by inch, the mud bubbling around her as the roots twisted tighter like the forest was breathing. With every cry they made, the woman watched with her dark eyes unblinking, the soft, cold smile still on her lips. Her hair floating in the fog, reaching for them like slow black rivers. They promised they would leave and never come back. They promised they would forget what they saw. They promised they would give her anything she wanted, if she would only let them go. But she shook her head slowly, and the fog thickened around them, pressing against their skin like cold hands. The trees groaned as they leaned closer, the branches scraping the air above their heads. The crows shifted on the branches, their feathers rustling like dry leaves as they watched the scene below with quiet black eyes. The roots pulled again, and the youngest one disappeared under the water, leaving only a swirl of bubbles and a single black feather floating on the surface. The others screamed her name, but the mud only rippled in silence, and the woman stepped closer, her feet never touching the mud, her hair brushing against their shoulders as she leaned down to look into their eyes. Her breath was cold against their skin and smelled like the deep forest, like moss and rain and something sharp like iron. Her eyes were so dark they could see themselves, reflected small and terrified in her gaze. The fog moved around them, hiding the trees, hiding the sky, hiding everything but her face and the cold water that was now up to their waists. The roots pulling at their legs like greedy fingers, dragging them down with slow, unhurried patience. One of them tried to fight the roots with shaking hands, clawing at the thick vines that held his ankles, but the vines only tightened, splitting the skin under his fingers, the black water filling the cuts. With cold pain he screamed, but the fog swallowed the sound. The crows above them called out a single harsh cry as the woman raised her hand again, and the roots pulled harder, dragging him under the water in a single smooth motion, his arms flailing for a moment before the mud closed over him, leaving only the small broken bubbles that popped softly in the cold air. The woman lowered her hand and turned to the last one left, her smile soft and patient. As she reached out her hand, the fog moved, with her swirling around her fingers like smoke. The last one fell to their knees in the mud, tears running down their face, mixing with the cold rain that began to fall from the fog. Like a soft whisper, the rain was cold and clean, but it could not wash away the mud. The woman knelt in front of the last one, her hand brushing against their cheek with a gentleness that was colder than any winter. Her hair wrapped around their shoulders like a shroud as she whispered in a language older than the trees, older than the bones beneath the ground. The forest grew quiet, the rain fell in silence, the crows watched without sound, and the roots pulled once more, taking the last breath from the last one. As the woman closed her eyes and the forest exhaled, they were gone by morning, leaving the van to rust in the wet grass. The doors still open, the seats soaked with fog. The forest was quiet under the gray sky. The crows perched on the crooked branches above the van, blinking slowly with black eyes. The fog was thin now, curling around the tires of the van like small ghosts. The woman stood at the edge of the trees, her hair long and black, drifting in the soft breeze, her eyes calm as she watched the empty road, her bare feet sinking into the wet moss as she breathed in the cold morning air. The forest around her was alive with the sounds of dripping water and the soft rustle of leaves, but there were no voices, no footsteps, only the quiet hush that comes after something has been taken. The ground near her feet was soft with mud and black water seeping back into the earth, small ripples moving across the puddles as if something below was still shifting. The crows flew down, landing near her feet, picking at the wet ground with their beaks, pulling at small strands of hair and scraps of cloth that were sinking into the mud. The woman lifted her hand and the crows went still, their feathers slick with rain, their eyes turned to her, waiting for the next command. She turned away from the road and walked into the trees, her feet leaving no marks on the wet earth, her hair brushing against the branches as she moved deeper into the forest. Behind her the fog closed in, swallowing the shape of the van until it was only a dark outline in the mist. The woman moved through the forest with the crows flying around her, the sound of their wings like soft whispers in the cold air. As she walked, the trees seemed to open for her, the branches bending to clear her path, the moss shifting to let her pass, the forest recognizing her as its own. In the deeper part of the woods, where the fog never lifted, there was a small clearing with dark stones set in a circle around a pit of black water. The woman stopped at the edge of the pit, looking down into the water where the reflections of the trees moved. Slowly across the surface in the water, shapes moved quietly, small and silent, the shapes of those who had tried to leave, the shapes of those who had promised to forget, the shapes of those who had screamed for help. The water held them gently, the ripples brushing against their faces as they floated just below the surface. Their eyes open and empty, their mouths closed around the last breath they would ever take. The woman lifted her hand and the shapes in the water turned their faces toward her, their empty eyes waiting for her command. She spoke in a voice that was older than the forest, older than the stones around the pit, older than the water itself. Her words were soft and cold like the fog that curled around the trees, and the shapes in the water began to rise, slowly lifting out of the black water dripping with mud and rain, their eyes empty, their feet bare, their bodies moving with the slow, careful steps of those who had forgotten how to walk. They followed her as she turned away from the pit, their feet leaving no tracks in the mud, their eyes never blinking as they followed her deeper into the forest where the fog was thick and the trees were silent.